Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Adam.
And the topic for this episode is the question of how we study and measure behavior. So a while back on episode 18, we read a paper that was about people who were arguing that there should be more behavior in neuroscience, that should be more of a focus, and especially more biologically relevant behavior that is natural to the animals that we study. And that is a lovely suggestion, but it can be difficult to do. So we're going to talk about a bit more of the reasons for why that's difficult to do, and we're going to talk about some of the methods that can help people actually do that, to study behavior in a rigorous way and hopefully study even more complex and natural behavior. And so the two papers that we've read for that, the first one is called Decision-Making Behaviors, Weighing Ethology, Complexity, and Sensory Motor Compatibility. And the first author on that is Ashley Joavinette, and it's in Current Opinion in Neurobiology from 2017. And then the second paper is called Computational Analysis of Behavior by Egnor and Bronson in the Annual Review of Neuroscience 2016. And so the first one kind of lays out how this is difficult, how studying behavior and natural behavior is difficult, and it uses an example of rodent decision-making. And then the second paper will get us more into the approaches that you can use to solve this problem of the difficulty of studying behavior. And so, as you may have noticed, we have a special guest for this topic. Adam, do you want to tell us about yourself and your relationship to the study of behavior?
Sure. I'm currently a postdoc at Princeton University with Mala Murthy, where we're trying to develop, where we use natural behaviors with this beautiful fruit fly courtship behavior, where when a male fruit fly really loves a female fruit fly, he'll sing to her and try to convince her to let him mate. But the hard part about this is, I know it's a great behavior, right? And the really interesting thing about it is it's very kind of dynamic and sensory driven, so the male has to respond to the female. But because it's a natural behavior, and as we'll discuss today, it's one of these things where you have to do a lot of modeling and come up with a lot of computational methods to understand what's going on, because the male has an impact on what the female does, and the female's behavior has an impact back on what the male does. So it's hard to parse out the kind of input and output without these computational models. So in the lab, I work on coming up with new computational models to dissect behavior, as well as kind of the neuroscience underlying it. And in grad school, I also found that even in what we consider much simpler behaviors, so foraging behavior, if you quantify what the animal is doing, you get a much better idea of how the animal is solving the problem and the kind of underlying neural correlates thereof.
All right, so you are very well positioned to talk about this.
Yeah, this is kind of my passion in neuroscience.
Okay, so I guess let's get into this example of rodent decision-making that comes up in the first paper. I guess we need to start by talking about what kind of counts as decision-making in neuroscience. That's probably some foundation that we should lay in talking about this paper. So I think they define it in the paper as the evaluation of alternatives and selection of actions. And that, I think, largely fits most people's kind of intuitive definition of decision-making. But we'll get into this. The way it's studied in neuroscience can come up in a lot of different ways. It can be as simple as evaluating what stimulus is presented to the animal. So if the animal is given a visual input, it has to respond as to what it thinks the visual input is showing, either a direction of motion or a color or something like that. So that's kind of the simple end, and then that can scale up to things like foraging and complex behaviors. So that's kind of the range of things that are called decision-making in neuroscience.
And at least on the simpler side of this, we've talked a little bit before about like where maybe there's some ambiguity as to whether it's a perceptual or decision-making effect. So like if it's a very sort of simple classification between two kinds of stimuli, you might think of that as perceptual discrimination. Or it's also termed as perceptual decision making, where the decision that you're making is mostly like how you should report having made some simple discrimination about like two kinds of stimuli.
I don't really have anything to add to that, except that I think in neuroscience, the word decision is kind of contentious. So what counts as a decision is very, varies from person to person. So some people, it often has to do with the size of the brain of the animal, whether it counts as a decision or not. So anything that a nematode does kind of is a reflex, unless you study nematodes, in which case it's a decision. And it ends up being basically any behavior the animal emits is some form of decision, whether it does a behavior or not. So behavior is a very flexible term, or decision, rather.
Well, and certainly if the experimenter is reading out from the behavior of the animal something that like reflects if it understood or performed some task, right? So like in the case of like turning your head, which comes up in this one, to or away from a stimulus. So like if there's a tone, and when like you hear the tone, you look in the opposite direction, for example, right? That would be something that require learning. But the same kind of thing, if you turn your head towards the stimulus, right? That might be the sort of more natural kind of way of orienting in response to an auditory stimulus.
And so the latter kind of seems more like a reflex, if it's
almost a
what
reflex.
you would do.
But if you can choose as to which one you're doing, then that becomes the readout mechanism for a decision you've made.
Yeah.
Reflecting your underlying like discrimination about what the sensory stimulus was.
Yeah. So, and this paper did a good job of kind of unpacking the problems with referring to so many of these different things as decision making. I don't know, it wasn't really explicitly trying to do that, but it just came up to me, that idea, because it talks about wanting to have things that are ethologically relevant, and you could argue that escape behaviors from predators, that's an ethologically relevant decision. So if you think that a predator is coming, do you run away or do you freeze, or that kind of thing? That's a real decision that an animal is making, almost more in line with what humans would think of as decisions, like how do you respond to this difficult situation. But when I hear that kind of study, I don't think, oh yeah, that's a decision-making study. I think that's like a predator study. That's like a study about, something that's like its own particular topic because it's a decision about what to do in response to a predator. Whereas like when I think of decision-making neuroscience, I think of these really simple lab settings that are like not really natural at all, and like that's decision-making.
But it's almost, that's almost reflecting you being over-conditioned by the sort of non-standard usages of decision-making in neuroscience. But also, I will say that I think the sort of predator example gets at maybe what Adam was bringing up a little bit with whether these are sort of reflexes or something. So like you might even think, and certainly like, psychologists of decades ago probably would have looked at a predator and thought like, this is a reactive, like almost reflex-like behavior, what the predator's doing. The bird of prey is not like thinking about what it's doing and deciding what to do. Now psychologists probably have a different attitude about this, but 50 years ago, I think maybe the dominant view in the field would have been, this is kind of all like reactive behavior.
Right. And I think there is a technical definition, which I think has to do with the number of synapses away from stimulus input to output that exists, or something like this. And when I worked with nematodes, this came up a lot because the nematode nervous system, the C. elegans nervous system, is 302 neurons. You can get from the input to the output within just a few synapses. So there's always the argument that it's all reflexive behavior. But whenever you dig into the neural circuitry, there's just so much going on that it's clear that there's, you could call it a reflex, but it's a very kind of diminished way of describing what's going on. And similarly for these, the escape behavior, you can consider it a reflex, which it probably certainly is in some ways, but also kind of falling on the example of, do you run away or do you just sit there and freeze or what? I think when we think about these ethological decisions, it's not just do you run away and freeze or do you freeze. It's every moment, do you run at this moment, do you freeze at this moment, and then the next moment, again, you're kind of continually making these decisions in some way.
Yeah, so like real-world decision-making is continuous, but most lab settings chunk it up into these discrete events where a single decision can be made.
Right.
So that's another way in which they're not usually natural in some way. I think also just, I guess, one last point I want to make on this distinction between what counts as decision-making. It kind of really made it obvious that if we want to study more ethologically relevant or more kind of real world examples in these animals to study something like decision making, it's just like it's harder and harder to pretend that they're good stand-ins for humans anymore. Because some of the ethologically relevant things are things that humans would never encounter or aren't ethologically relevant for humans. And when you can make it an abstract lab experiment that's both unnatural for the mouse and for a human that would be doing it, that it feels like, oh yeah, we're studying the same thing. Like this mouse is a stand-in for a human. But if it's ethologically relevant for the animal that you're studying and not ever relevant for humans, then it's like you can't ignore that you're not studying a human if you're doing neuroscience in an attempt to understand humans ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the difference between trying to understand a particular neural circuit because you think that particular neural circuit is implemented in humans and rodents and whatever you're studying, or trying to understand how nervous systems kind of respond to their ecological pressures, and if there's common ways to respond, or if there's particular niches that are different from animal to animal, how that would be implemented in the nervous system. Because certainly there are going to be ecological pressures that are different for humans from any other animal. And I think it's only if you have kind of a consistent understanding of all these different pressures that you'll really understand how the behaviors work.
Okay, so I guess we can get into the 3 factors that this paper lays out as relevant for assessing kind of the use of a particular task. And so the 3 factors are ecological validity, stimulus-response compatibility, and task complexity. So we've kind of touched on ecological validity. It's the idea that the stimulus that you're giving the animal and the response that it would have are within the scope of what the animal would do in its, I guess, natural setting by some definition. I mean, obviously there's vagaries to what would fall within that, but the idea is that this is something that the animal would encounter and do in nature.
And the orienting of some form or another is like a common example of this. So, I mean, I brought it up with the case of a tone. There's also some old famous experiments or something where, like, you try to train a chicken to go away from a food source in order to get food. And I guess
it's hard for them.
Claims that I've heard is that that's, like, not even possible for certain animals, or at least it wasn't possible for the experimenters to train the animals in those settings. Whereas, like, you know, higher mammals, monkeys, humans, can, like, obviously be straightforwardly instructed to do this, or maybe figure it out in some cases through trial and error.
But I want to clarify, you are conflating ecological validity with stimulus-response compatibility. So those are 2 separate dimensions in this. But yes, I understand your point. So ecological validity is the idea that the stimulus that you use is natural. So you would use the sound that another animal makes instead of a pure tone that's generated by a computer. And the stimulus-response compatibility is the notion that the animal would produce its normal response to that. So if it hears the call of a mate, it would orient towards it, it would go towards that, whereas trying to train them to go away from that is not natural. Even if the stimulus is natural, if you're expecting an unnatural response to a natural stimulus, then that's not good on the stimulus response compatibility scale.
Yeah, sorry, I was mixing this 2 up.
How dare you?
And then I guess the third one is task complexity, which is like the number of variables in the experiment.
Yeah, so the number of things that you as the experimenter can vary, and then the number of aspects of the behavior that you'd be reading as an output.
So I guess it's worth being explicit that these are measures, and I mean this comes up in the second paper that we saw. These are measures of a task's naturalness rather than like the naturalness of the behavior that's induced by the task. Because like in the second paper, they have different axes, and we'll talk about those. Not that we have to agree with these axes completely, right? But the second paper does a little bit of a sort of different axes for what are the dimensions of the behavior generated by animals. So these are specifically here talking about like the naturalness of the task.
Yeah, like the full task setting, not just
well, and yeah, it's not so much about behavior as it is about the experiment in which you induce behavior. Like,
yeah.
So you might consider a fourth axis for the fourth dimension, which is behavioral naturalness or behavioral difficulty.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that as I was reading this. I mean, some of these axes to me feel actually like, I mean, people when they draw axes often draw them like orthogonally for the
Right.
purposes of illustration. So like they're perpendicular. Some of these felt kind of correlated, and I don't mean just because I was confounding them irresponsibly, but because these all have to do in sometimes overlapping ways with the with the task itself, and not with what the animal generates. And
Yeah, I guess the naturalness of the behavior that the animal would generate, I think in this framework would fall under the ecological validity axis, because it's the validity of the stimulus, like using a call versus a tone, and also of the output. So the example they give is trying to make the animal use a joystick instead of running.
Yeah, so I think that's good, but and I don't want to get too much into it now. But in the next paper, they talk about like a behavioral entropy, so like the diversity of behavior generated as being natural or unnatural, and all of these axes involve kind of overtraining, probably.
Yeah,
right?
because it still is a probably like a trial by trial lab setting.
Exactly. So it's going to be the case when you're dealing with all of these tasks that you've trained an animal to do like the same thing. So whether or not it was an orienting response to an unnatural or natural tone, like it's not do the natural diversity of things you would do in response to that tone. It's do something very specific, probably to get reward, like very locally.
Yeah, and I don't know if you're going to talk about this now or later, but this is kind of one of the important points of the whole like ethological framework, or the kind of natural behavior framework, where there's some natural behaviors where you just don't have to train the animal at all, right? Like you just put an animal in a chamber with some food hidden away, and the animal just naturally go and try to find that food, right? There's no training required. The animal just does it on its own. On the other hand, there's these behaviors where you have an animal kind of with its nose in some port, and it has to then hold it there and then move left or right to choose another port. And that's a very unnatural behavior that has to be trained. And there's kind of in between, and I don't know where that counts on this axis, where they try to make these behaviors a little more natural. So like the animal's on a floating ball and it's allowed to kind of walk around and be a little happier. Or the animal's even just freely allowed to wander around on its own, to poke his nose in whenever he wants, things like this. And that changes a lot, I think, about how difficult it is to train the animal or for the animal to do the task.
Yeah. So this, a thing that this paper makes a point of noting is how these different axes impact trainability. And so, there is an argument that the less natural either the stimulus or the output is, the longer it will take the animal to train. And then also, especially as we were saying, the pairing of, an unnatural response to a natural output can be very difficult to train, maybe even more difficult than if you just used a fake stimulus and tried to pair it with something, because there's these innate, reflexes or whatever you want to call them that are already there that you have to overcome with the training.
But so it's just so I don't just I don't want to just make a throwaway comment before. And also to be clear, I think that generally these are very good ways of characterizing the task. I'm just trying to think about kind of whatever caveats come to mind. When you think about the task complexity as having both like a sort of a visual and auditory component, for example, as one way of complexifying a task, like having there be multiple dimensions to the stimulus, that also affects how the ethological validity of the stimulus response, perhaps, right? So maybe by making the stimulus space richer, you can get at sort of more both diverse and natural set of behavioral responses to those kinds of natural stimuli. Whereas if you restrict things to one stimulus dimension or one parameter in the stimulus you can tune, maybe you won't be able to get sort of the appropriate level of richness of stimulus response.
Right. And that has a big impact on how the nervous system solves these problems too, right? So something that's very simple that you've just overtrained this animal on, it's probably going to be responding to that stimulus in a very different way than if it had, some kind of easier task that it could solve with maybe more task complexity, but I don't know what the right combination of these axes is here. But I guess more difficult tasks that require kind of more mental complexity means the animal's going to be solving in fundamentally different ways than if it just kind of learns it enough that it's kind of reflexive.
Yeah. And then the core at all of this is, the reason that people haven't studied very ethologically relevant things historically is because it's hard to characterize them and vary them in a precise way that you would associate with doing science on them. So adding dimensionality to the stimulus, that could make the stimulus more realistic, because usually, if you're exploring an environment, you get sights and sounds and smells, which is actually something that's usually not incorporated unless you're explicitly studying olfaction. But in doing so, then it's hard to vary those stimuli in a way that is controllable and knowable and still ethologically relevant. So like if you wanted to study something that's relevant to humans, like faces, and you want to study the effect of a particular dimension of the face, like if you have a hypothesis that like people, believe that people with eyes that are farther apart are like not trustworthy or something like that, which I don't know, maybe that's a hypothesis. But my point is just that if you want to use real stimuli, like real faces, and you just find, the dimension that's eye distance, that's probably correlated with a bunch of other stuff in the face, maybe the width of the face or the length of the face or something like that. And so you can never isolate something purely in an ethologically relevant stimulus because it's probably correlated with a bunch of other things. And so that's kind of the motivation for why we've simplified things down to one dimension in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that this is an argument we're having right now about behavior. But if you look at the kind of neuroscience literature, we had this exact same argument 20 years ago about the stimuli we're presenting animals just in general. So there's this big debate about natural stimuli versus, I don't know what you call them, artificial stimuli, where in kind of visual tasks, people display these gratings, right, to animals. And they say, can the animal detect a grating with such and such contrast or a higher contrast or something like this? And there's this big debate, 15 or 20 years ago about whether it might be more useful to provide natural images, so images of forests or images taken from cameras where people are just walking around and there's these correlations that are much more natural. So natural images are very correlated from pixel to pixel, from point to point, moment to moment. And this induces just differences in how the nervous system reacts. And I think we're seeing kind of the same thing here with behavior, in terms of how useful is it to study kind of the natural or ethological behaviors versus a kind of simplified grading equivalent behavior. And the answer is always both, right? But
yeah.
I think the answer is both, and there are people on both sides. Personally, I tend to come down fairly strongly on the side of natural stimuli being more
That's because you don't
informative.
do experiments.
Yeah, I understand. No, but I think it also, I would actually not say it's because I don't do experiments. I would say as a person who does and has done computational modeling and data analysis in response to stimuli, the kinds of models you can learn and explore when dealing with data sets that involve natural behavior or natural stimulus and responses to natural stimuli, you can do much more with them in terms of computational modeling. So I think often, and this is a broader point, and we don't have to dwell on this unless people want to, argue with me about it. But I think one of the main reasons that people tend to go for simple settings, both on the perceptual side with the presentation of stimuli and for behavioral responses, is because they don't know how they're going to analyze the data if they make it more diverse and less constrained. And as scientists, that's like a valid thing. You want to know that you're going to be able to answer a question or study something useful. But I think it is also the case now, and I think essentially there was a victory, without digressing too much. I think that the natural stimuli won when it came to vision. Why? Because now there's like deep learning models and other kinds of machine learning models that can handle the complexity of natural data sets. And so comparing, responses of neurons to natural stimuli against neural networks and other things like this is feasible in a way that it wasn't 15 or 20 years ago. And so the case is more compelling that you should just gather large data sets that involve like rich behavior or rich stimulus presentation, and basically data scientists or computational neuroscientists who know machine learning will be able to figure out what to do with that data after the fact. They'll be able to do exploratory data analysis and learn things and fit interesting models that tell you things. And I think that will probably drive the field faster than only collecting data that you're confident that you'll be able to analyze using simple, totally comprehensible techniques right now.
Yeah, it still is a both situation, though, because you can do the exploratory data analysis that way, but eventually when you come up with a particular hypothesis, it's probably going to require that you test that particular hypothesis in some weird specific case that maybe isn't natural.
I'm not convinced. I mean, when someone comes up with a hypothesis based on, looking at how deep neural networks trained on natural images can predict, neurons in visual cortex or fMRI data of visual cortex, the kinds of predictions you generate aren't, okay, now let me go in with like vertical bars and show them to the animal. The kinds of predictions you generate are usually, let's come up with a pretty natural, maybe slightly non-natural stimulus, and discriminate between already rather complicated models on the basis of even more rich data.
So let me provide, I think, a concrete example that maybe is in between both of you. I'm not sure. So someone in our lab had been studying this behavior, again, this fruit fly courtship. So fruit flies sing. And the male fruit fly sings louder when the female is further away. Kind of like when we were talking, if you're further away, I'm going to speak louder. So he had taken this data, and he took this natural data of just flies freely courting, and he did a lot of analysis and found this kind of effect that, the male will sing louder when the female's further away. So then he wanted to test that to make sure that that was true, and he did this experiment where he put a fly on kind of floating ball, stimulated the neurons that would cause the fly to sing, so he's kind of artificially singing, and then present a fixed visual stimuli. So that tells us two things, and you do see that. You see the effect. So when the stimuli is smaller and it looks further away, he'll sing louder than when it's large and it's close. So that tells us one thing, which is that it's actually visually driven. So it could have been olfactory driven. It could have been pheromonally driven. You wouldn't know that from the data, just from the natural data. And two, when he was testing this kind of simplified stimuli, there are other things that came out that he wouldn't have seen from the natural data. So the fly will only change a song if the stimulus moves in a way that's consistent with how the female would move, like in the natural data. So if the aspect ratio, so the size of this kind of moving dot, this fictive female, varies wildly, so it gets really tall, then really wide, then really tall, then really wide, he doesn't sing in a normal way, or he doesn't change his song like it would if it was getting close or getting far away. So it requires other statistics to change in a particular way that you wouldn't see in the natural data.
Yeah, that makes sense, that something that can be observed naturally still needs to be teased apart in these somewhat unnatural
because you're only
ways.
Exploring a subset of the statistics, right?
Yeah. And especially if you're going to do something, I mean, we can get into this with the methods for recording behavior, but if you're going to do something like try to activate some neurons, you necessarily have to do that in a reduced setting. The animal usually needs to be head fixed and not moving and not in their completely natural environment.
Yeah, so I think broadly this is a good example that makes the point that you were trying to make, and I think that science sounds excellently done. My response, though, going back to this at sort of a philosophical level, is you probably could have learned the same thing by curated natural images, right? In terms of, you could have shown the fly video of another fly at a distance versus closer up.
Well, this is already removing it from completely natural.
No, but if you wanted to say that it was visually driven, right, you could have done a study that involved natural data. I mean, essentially the fact that you didn't need to use natural data in this case relies upon the fact that a fly will confuse a dot on a screen essentially with another fly, which it's unclear if you would expect that kind of phenomenon to scale well, right? In terms of if studying a human, would you be able to do something similar if studying, obviously all animals will have failure modes of varying extents, right? I mean, I've seen ethology studies where in the wild you can take, I don't know, a lion, I believe it was a lion, where they would do studies where you could get a stuffed lion or something like this to serve as a female that a male lion would try to mount or something in the wild. So I mean, animals will it's basically like a glorified sex doll for the animal study. I mean, animals will have these kind of weird gaps where they will confuse artificial things for natural things. But in some sense, the upshot of what you just like described, is that it was basically like you needed to get certain things right, like the like the aspect ratio, whatever, before it would confuse it for a natural stimuli. And so it's to me, that's still I get the point you're making, that you can learn something scientifically from an artificialized stimuli, but
it's how you figure out what the essence of the behavior and the stimulus is by kind of taking it at the full natural input and paring it down and seeing if the behavior changes. And once it changes, you say, okay, now I know what the necessary and sufficient set.
I mean, and so this was part of the upshot of the vision stuff a while back. So in the earlier iteration of people using naturalistic images to study vision, they would do things like scramble the images or things like this, where they're like partly natural and partly unnatural, and they're looking at the dimensions along which they're natural and unnatural as clues into what's relevant for processing.
Yeah, and one of the relevant outputs from that was to figure out that neurons respond better, kind of more strongly and perhaps more reliably, to truly natural images rather than scrambled ones. So it's not even just on the level of behavior that it's relevant if you're using a natural stimulus. The actual neural response on like the front end of sensory processing can.
And so I don't want to like hit this too hard, because like overall, like I think you can learn a lot from artificial stimuli to some extent, but it almost feels like where you get the most bang for your buck with respect to artificial stimuli is during this kind of awkward transient where like you don't even know yet what's the relevant stimuli, and it seems like most of the neuroscience will come after. Like it's like, okay, so in the fruit fly case, right? At first you didn't know if it was visually driven, but now that you know it's visually driven and what like features it's like, yeah, like for the next 100 years of studying fruit flies, probably they'll have to use things that are like more natural or in the natural side. It's like you could get away with artificial stimuli because we knew so little.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I mean, that's complicated. I feel like it goes both ways. Once you know, I guess it depends on what you're calling artificial. If you know that the only thing the fly needs is a visual stimulus that looks like the female enough, then do you call that pared down thing a natural stimulus now that you know that?
No, because I don't think you'll want to stick with that. Like you don't want to like ghettoize the research into a weird trajectory where it's dependent on findings that may be precarious later.
Yeah, no,
right?
I agree.
Just like.
So the advantage of this is it tells you it suggests the computations that the underlying nervous system is doing. So then you can like go target particular neural subsets that you already know are involved in, motion detection or aspect ratio or something like this, and target them to see if they're involved in this behavior. But I agree, you're right. Once you kind of understand that circuitry, then you want to just display the most natural stimuli that you can. So it's this kind of back and forth. You want to have the most natural you can, pare it down to really, see what breaks it. Understand the neural circuitry, bring it back to the natural, as natural as you can get, and go back and forth.
Yeah, I largely agree with this, right? I mean, but and just to be very concrete, like, I mean, I think the failure mode of not doing that, right? If you stick to the artificial stimuli for a long trajectory, like a decade of like a whole research literature where it just sticks to some particular artificial stimuli, you get to the kind of place where like, lab rodents have gotten, where they're like essentially evolved to be different from wild type rodents in a way that like you can't even. And I don't mean with the animals here, right? I mean with the stimuli, right? Like the stimuli have gone down some weird evolutionary trajectory of experimenter selection so that they get you scientific findings without maybe telling you things that are not the first time you use them, obviously, right? But like...
Yeah, but there is a weird, it's like, I'm using this stimulus because this other person before me used this stimulus, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
But no, I was thinking in terms of the benefits of figuring out what the sufficient stimulus is. It's one that it'll help you know which neural circuits are important, so knowing that it's a visual stimulus that drives this behavior is useful. But then it's also useful because then if you want to incorporate that into some other experiment, like I'm thinking of how we put mice into virtual reality. Like, for virtual reality to work, to study navigation, to study like mice in virtual mazes, we need to have a sense of what the sufficient stimulus is that counts as a visual input to them or a tactile input. So like, as part of the larger plan of designing experiments for other studies, if we know what the sufficient stimulus is, that can be helpful, because you can't recreate everything. So it's helpful to know what you need to recreate. I also kind of want to speak to, like, the fly example was a good thing that really, like, put into concrete terms the range of complexity and kind of simplicity that artificial stimuli can have. But there's also, they bring up in this paper, the notion of trying to train a non-human primate to do a task where they either need to classify an image based on color or motion. So, like, you could have a green, object going left, and if it's a trial where you're supposed to pay attention to motion, then you would say leftward. That would be the output that the animal would have to indicate. If you have to pay attention to color, then you'd indicate green. And just, like, that thing that seems fairly simple to us humans is something that's, like, cited in here as a triumph of task complexity. That they were able to get, primates to do this. And I imagine, I don't remember the paper. They don't always tell you in the paper how long it takes to train the animals. It probably took 6 months to a year. I feel like that's the right time scale for how long it took to train an animal that was already, like, trained to do some kind of task, to do this particular task, is my guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing that I was getting at, kind of indirectly, about, I guess, in this case, how task complexity could or could not be correlated with, I guess, specifically, like, something like ecological validity. I mean, in their case, they're framing it as ecological validity of stimulus response, which is, I mean ecological validity a little bit more broadly. But just to be, the reason I keep confusing, like, the ecological validity of stimulus response versus stimulus response compatibility is because it feels like there's another thing, which is, like, if you're engaging in a natural behavior, like, how likely is that behavior to, like, occur in nature, which isn't about stimulus response so much, but it's like, I guess, take for example, like, if you were asked to solve some small puzzle to get your food. Right, like, in a lab setting, it might be a contrived puzzle, but, like, in nature, right, there's famous examples of, like, chimpanzees using sticks that they've licked to get termites out of a hole, or other kinds of examples where, like, you have to climb up a tree to get fruit. And it feels like those are somehow about, like, how natural the stimuli are in the first place, and then also, like, what the appropriate response is in those settings. And those aren't totally orthogonal. They're highly entangled. You have associations about, like, certain natural stimuli having certain appropriate responses. But then there's also, like, a task complexity component that fits in nicely with this, which is, like, how hard that puzzle is to get to get your food, which is different than, like, just the number of parameters. It might be, like, the number of events you have to sequence together. And so this is why I actually liked the graph, the axis stratification in the next paper, which, just, like, to preview it, was about the entropy of the behavior versus the length of the behavior, where the entropy of the behavior was how diverse the behavior is, and the length is kind of how long the behavior is, right? So, like, how much you have to sequence together. Because it feels to me like you can't describe task complexity without also getting at how diverse of behaviors are relevant for that task, not just how many variables there are that the experimenter can control, and also, like, how long of a planning horizon there is for that task, or how many, like, sequential problems the animal has to solve. Those feel like innately coupled with task complexity.
Yes, I agree with all of this.
They also kind of talk about ways of training animals and how you should use rewards instead of punishments because timeouts make mice discouraged. And I just found that it felt like parenting advice or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is actual parenting advice, right? Always give positive feedback and not negative feedback, because it doesn't actually train the animal.
And there is kind of like some schools want kids to spend a lot of time outside and doing their own exploratory, self-driven learning, and that feels like that's ethologically relevant rather than sitting in a classroom and have someone teach you. So I feel like a lot of this is probably transferable to parenting and teaching. So we can move on to that paper now, unless anyone has any last things they want to say about the first one. So this paper was laying out some of the kind of trade-offs between having more biologically realistic behavior, but also needing to be able to actually measure it. And so this brings up things like if an animal is head fixed so that they can't move, but you're trying to use a big microscope to record from neurons in their brain, and so they need to remain underneath the microscope. That can impact the types of behaviors that the animal can engage in, not in just the obvious ways, like they can't, run around, but also in ways that I didn't always know. Like it said that mice don't vocalize when they're head fixed, and birds also don't sing when they're head fixed. I think they need to be like coaxed into it, which are things that you wouldn't necessarily think wouldn't happen during head fixation, because physically they could. It's just not, they don't think to produce that when they're head fixed. And they consider the head fix setup like stressful for the animal potentially, and so you want to find ways to reduce that stress if you want to make sure that you're studying what you're studying and not a stress response.
So did you want to talk about the methods here, or do you want to talk about how they're trying to classify this behavior in terms of entropy and length first?
Maybe let's discuss that a little bit further first, and then we can talk about, like, most of the paper is devoted, I think, to description of methods that are used for automatic behavioral analysis. But first, they kind of just briefly address, like, what is behavior, right? Which is kind of what we've been talking about a lot.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. So I think it's really funny that when you ask people about behavior, we kind of implicitly have this idea of what we mean when we're talking about it. But there's this great paper from maybe 5 or 6 years ago where it was in some behavior journal, and they sent out a survey to a bunch of other people who'd submitted this journal and asked them, a series of questions. What counts as behavior? Does this count as behavior? Does this count as behavior? Does this count as behavior? And they got responses from like 100 or so of the people. And what they found is that people just did not agree on what counted as behavior, and they weren't internally consistent about behavior. So they would have multiple answers that, like, yes, this counts as behavior, no, this does not, yes, this does, and they were all kind of, mutually contradictory. I think because we mean so many different things when we say behavior, so I think it'll be useful to be really careful and really specific when we talk about behavior in this paper.
Okay, so Adam, what do you think? Give us your attempt. We'll put you on the spot here.
I cheat. Whatever an animal does, that's behavior.
No, I'm sympathetic to that. I don't think that's really a cheat.
So I think when people talk about it, so right now, I think a lot of times when people say behavior, they mean repeated sequences of actions that an animal does. So, eating is a behavior, reaching is a behavior, licking is a behavior. But you can sorry.
Can I clarify your definition? Is it everything physical that an animal does, or can thought be a behavior?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of definitions. I just kind of use things willy-nilly because I don't think it's just animals. I think that amoebas can behave. I think that.
But it does seem like behavior. Right? When we say behavior, we usually mean physically, like outwardly observable things. I think maybe that's at least a minimal definition. Practically speaking,
I like the idea. So breathing involves like musculature, and so you could say like, if there's muscles involved that are actuated by neurons, then that's behavior. I actually like the idea of being like even slightly more removed and saying there could be such a thing as cognitive behavior. Like if you're sitting still and you're not even moving your eyes in a way that like give away like what you're thinking about or something.
Does thinking count as a behavior?
Yeah. And I like the idea of there being cognitive behavior, right? Like where the cognitive behavior is like what you're doing with your neurons internally. I don't mean that. I mean that a bit loosely, right? But it's just like if you are doing something, for example, considering something that just happened, like, reflecting upon something that you did, or like, for example, planning what you might do, but in a way where you're not moving your muscles or, including your eyes to do that.
Right. And it's important that like not doing something is also behavior, right? Like,
oh yeah.
If you smell something that you don't like, just sitting there is a very definite behavior, right? You're not doing anything, but you're still responding in some way.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's both the kind of action level of behavior, but also it's called sensory motor behavior. So how you respond to the environment and the ways that you pattern your actions based on what you perceive or what you kind of cognitively are processing at the moment.
Yeah, and another thing that this paper talks about briefly that I kind of forgot is that the quantification of behavior, this automatic analysis of behavior, is useful not just for people who are trying to record from neurons or anything. Like, it's also, you can, make a genetic manipulation in an animal that you never, look at the brain of and just observe what behaviors are different. And so that's why it's important to have, they kind of talk about, like a vocabulary of behavior or a basis set of behaviors that you can use to describe behavior so that you can say, this animal is showing different patterns than this other animal, presumably due to the genetic manipulation that you induced in them.
Right. No, and that's been super useful, I think. I think the hard part is the controlling of the environment and the controlling of how the animal interacts with the environment. So I don't remember where I saw this example. Maybe one of Bob Data's papers. Anytime you manipulate the animal, it's not just going to change the basis set of what it does, but both the sequence of what it does, and it's going to interact with the environment in very different ways. And that interaction with the environment is going to itself induce possibly a whole different basis, right, of how to respond that you wouldn't see otherwise because it maybe wasn't interacting with the environment in that particular way before.
Yeah, and that speaks to a problem that can come by using the machine learning methods that they talk about here. So if you are trying to automate the process of classifying behavior, you have like a bunch of videos of animals behaving, and you train some sort of algorithm on a subset of the data. Like you say, okay, this set of video frames is equal to this behavior, and you train the model based on your labels. If you trained it on an animal without a mutation, it might not perform well on an animal that has mutation because it's been kind of overtrained to the particulars of that animal, or even to the particulars of, like they reference, the lighting of the environment and the background of the environment. There's all these different things that really need to be well preserved if you're going to try to automate this process. And that's not, there are different things that are problematic if you have people do it. Obviously, there's subjectivity. Like, I remember as an undergrad in a mouse lab having to label hours of mouse behavioral videos, and you're supposed to kind of like, if it's a swim test for a mouse, you're supposed to clock how long they spend swimming. So you have like a little timer, and you try to add up, how many minutes they've been swimming versus not swimming, or how many times they enter a certain area of the field that they're in. And those things, they kind of sound objective because they're quantified, but they're not. It's still like, oh, well, it kind of like put, half of its body in there. Do I count that as an enter? Like that kind of thing. And so automating it can just, it'll at least codify the biases and the subjectivity of a particular scorer so that it can be used broadly across all of the experiments rather than having different people score different experiments. But it still will be codifying that, and it might not, for kind of other reasons, transfer to different settings. So that's something that you have to look out for.
Right, and I'd kind of go even further than that and say that, one of the hard parts about scoring an animal behavior as a human is that I don't know what natural cricket behavior is, or how my kind of biases of what behavior, animal behavior should look like with crickets or with flies or with any of these other animals. And one of the advantages of these kind of computational methods is they can just try to pick up variation, in as unbiased a way as possible, and, hope that that variation is meaningful to the animal rather than to me.
I guess those methods are usually the unsupervised learning methods for classifying behavior.
Right.
So that would be if you gave the classifier, hours of video data chunked up into some number of frames and told it to look for frames that seemed similar and frames that seemed dissimilar. And then that, things can emerge from that are plausibly like the vocabulary of the behavior, but in a way that's not at all influenced by what humans assume is the vocabulary of the behavior.
Right.
And they said they did that for nematodes, and they came up with 4 different positions that can be kind of added together to explain the full variability of the behavior, and that was used to identify certain genetic
and this is actually something I think is really interesting. I think in kind of the intellectual history of how these computational methods for analyzing behavior that we have now have come online is they started off with just very simple tracking. I think anyone who has been in an animal lab or a neuroscience lab that has computational experience has tried their hand at writing a tracker and realized how insanely difficult it really is. For something that seems so easy, it's really difficult to track.
So you mean
animals.
Just to know the position of the animal at each point in time?
So like you're looking like top down at like the field of view. There's a mouse or a fly or some kind of, or a C. elegans worm, like somewhere on like a dish or like a arena, and you've got like a top down camera probably is the standard setting.
Yeah, and you have to not only, you could find the center of the animal, but also the direction it's facing, which is very difficult to program into a computer for a lot of animals. The fact that if you have multiple animals in an arena or under your camera, that any two pixels from frame to frame belong to the same animal or different animals. These are all very difficult problems that I think took a lot longer to solve or to be reasonable, have reasonable solutions than you would have thought. So I think it started off with just this tracking of animals, which took a long time and took a certain amount of computational resources that we didn't have 20 years ago. And it went from there to this paper by Greg Stevens, who was in Bill Bialik's lab at the time, where he took these nematodes and basically just applied PCA, so principal components analysis, onto the spine of the animal, so the angles between each joint, fictional or discretized joint of the animal. And he found that you could parameterize basically everything the animal does with just kind of 4 sets of patterns. So basically there are 4 kind of patterns that you could flip between or, have some combination thereof and describe exactly how the animal was positioned at any moment in time. And I think, beyond that, where we've gone has been taking these joints and these postures of animals and trying to come up with ways where you can get sequences of posture. So these repeated sequences, so like reaching is a repeated sequence, or the nematode turning in a particular way is a particular sequence, and discretizing those has been where the field has gone since then. And where it goes next, we'll see.
Yeah, so that's something I'm very enthusiastic about the unsupervised approach, where you just let patterns in the data be found. And they talk about another example where they did that for bird song. So take like a recording of a song, and they were able to reduce it to 4 different features, which, they showed correlated, like certain bits of those features change with learning and that kind of thing. But especially with something like bird song or anything that's at all social, I don't know that necessarily the patterns that emerge through that kind of analysis always would relate to what's relevant to the other animal who's taking in that behavior. So are these the 4 dimensions that another bird is paying attention to in that bird song, or are these just the 4 dimensions that kind of fell out of the data?
Right, and I think that's, again, where you have to go and take that kind of natural data and then manipulate in an experimental way, and see if those are meaningful either by recording from the other animal or by manipulating yourself and playing some fictive song back to the other animal that kind of varies along these axes or potentially along other axes, and see if that has some effect on the other animal.
Yeah, it just makes me think about like what would ground truth in this kind of behavioral analysis be, and I just think that there probably really isn't ground truth in behavioral analysis. There's nothing that is the answer that is being sought. It's all going to be somewhat relative to what questions you're asking.
Yeah, and I think the real answer is whatever's useful, and whatever, as if we're talking as neuroscientists, I don't know, but as neuroscientists, whatever it tells you more about the nervous system. So do these particular axes of the birdsong have a meaning in the nervous system? Either from the production, like are there kind of different axes of variation that the animal can actually produce, or in the receiving of the other animal. And I think that's the only kind of ground truth you can get is how does the nervous system produce or interpret these things.
Another thing that's not exactly related to the automatic processing of behavior, but something that they mentioned in this paper that I just wanted to cite as an example of what can happen if you prematurely simplify your behavioral test, is they talk about this tube test. example, where they would put two mice in a narrow tube and observe kind of who gets the right of way, which mouse gets to go first in that example. And they were assuming that that was a measure of dominance in the mice, that the dominant one, I think, would be allowed to go first. But then eventually they observed more naturalistic behavior, like giving two mice access to food and seeing who gets the food first or who would win in a fight between them. And they realized that that tube test measure was not at all related to dominance. I think they said it was even anti-correlated with dominance. So they were just kind of made up a test of what they assumed represented dominance, presumably due to human biases, as like what you would do if you passed someone in a narrow hallway or something. But it ended up being not relevant for the mice.
Yeah. No, that's why these interpreting behavior is difficult unless you understand the ecological relevance. You
can come up with a just so story. In this case, It's like, oh yeah, well, like the dominant one like stands there and watches intimidatingly as the submissive one scurries past it. But you could have made up the opposite story if the opposite had been true.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back, I think, to the Joavinet paper's point, which is you need to understand the ethology first before you can understand what the behaviors have meaning of, or what the meaning of the behavior is.
Yeah.
And I think an important point, which I don't remember how much to go into in this paper, is that these behaviors that you quantify have really, really strong impacts on the animal's nervous system. So one kind of really popular field of study right now is when animals run, it changes dramatically how the visual system responds to the visual environment. It changes all sorts of things throughout the brain. So different particular behaviors that the animals emit or that the animals produce cause these huge changes in how the brain responds to all sorts of things in the environment that you wouldn't normally think of.
Yeah, I think this paper advises, no matter what you're doing, you should be measuring pupil size of the animal and, what their hands are doing or if they're running, that kind of stuff. Because, it has been revealed that a lot of those things, will help you predict changes in neural activity. And so if neural activity is changing in response to those things, even if you don't care about those things, you're going to need to know that to analyze the neural activity properly.
Right. And this isn't, one of the papers that you were talking about, but there's a paper that just came out from Carson Stringer and Marius Pachitariu, I believe his last name is pronounced, where they were recording from, I think, tens of thousands of neurons on the order of that, and imaging the animal's response to visual stimuli as well as what the animal is doing at any moment in time. And some huge fraction of the animal's cortical responses in sensory systems is purely behavioral, has nothing to do with the visual stimuli. So unless you understand what the animal is doing at any moment in time, you won't understand how it interacts with the sensory environment. You'll get this large amount of kind of noise in your system, which is actually very highly correlated with particular things animals doing.
Yeah. So, are there any last thoughts on measuring behavior?
Well, I'll just put in my plug. So, I come from maybe a systems neuroscience sensory background. And I think one of the things that's been missing from a lot of these methods has been this kind of combination of classical tools for understanding the psychophysics of how an animal is responding with the classification of the joint movement or the motor movement of the animal. So, as I was trying to say earlier, there's this definition of behavior, which is just the actions of an animal. But, actions have meaning and this context outside of just what the animal's actually doing. And I think one thing going forward that'll be really interesting is how you combine these ideas of, responding to the environment and context with tools to kind of, in an unsupervised way, find out what the animal's doing. So kind of expand this definition of what we mean when we say behavior.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, all right. Till next time.
Hey
Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.